We are back and we are here to announce your new project.
Yes. So as we've already mentioned in a previous episode, and a few people have checked in to ask me about, I undertook the endeavor of creating an audio version of a book / collection of writings that were very...
blog posts.
Blog posts. The problem is there's so much variance in what counts as a blog post that the quality variance is so high that I don't know that quite does it justice.
Yeah,
let's maybe say collection of essays is much more accurate. But it was a piece of work that was really impactful to me, and from what you've said to you as well. And I found that I wanted to share it with people, but there were no audio versions. And I know a lot of our peers and friends and family really mainly consume things through audio these days, be it audiobooks and podcasts.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, if no one else has done it, this would be a good thing for the world to have in it. And so I reached out to the author, Nate Soares, and asked him if I could have his go-ahead to produce the Replacing Guilt series. And that has now just recently gone live onto all the major podcasting hosts. Well, you self-host it, but it's distributed on all the different platforms. Podcasting is very old school, which is maybe why it's actually pretty cool. But yeah, and so this is a little primer intro from us telling you what that's about and why you should probably listen to it. So seeing as how you're the one who introduced me to it and got me onto it in the first place, what were your takeaways and why do you think people should read Replacing Guilt or listen to the audio version?
Well, you know what? I'm actually going to pass. I'm going to avoid the question at the start because I just wanted to point out that, and this is just interesting to me, but you're basically joining a sort of lineage of other people in this sort of informal rationalist community that undertake this kind of project. And I just thought it's worth flagging that and pointing it out because obviously a big part of what people who have this sort of worldview believe is, you know, if there is some good, you should like undertake it, especially if it's low hanging, easy to achieve good, right? Yeah. And so, for example, you are following the trend of the many people who, for example, took Eliezer Yudkowsky's essays in Rationality from AI to Zombies and made that into an audio version and released it as a series of podcasts.
Yeah, the famed sequences, yeah.
The sequences, right? There's also the people who put together the Worm series, the audiobook. The Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality series was also released as a series of podcasts, and Metropolitan Man was recorded and released. Yep. And so I'm just doing that to point out, first of all, because if any of those have appealed to you in the past, Replacing Guilt is the sort of next logical step. And also, if you are finding this and you've never heard of any of those, although I don't know how you would have listened to this podcast for this long and not at least have heard of the sequences, not because you should know, but because we are so insistent on mentioning them.
Yeah.
But my hope is then that you will try a few of these out and maybe become one of those people who also reaches out to someone, makes a new connection, and tries to add to the body of published audio work in the world, because it's relatively simple, as I think you'll attest, and it can make a big difference to anyone who has the kind of job or the kind of free time in their life where they really can only consume something by audio, right? They work with their hands or they have to move about, and that's awesome. So congratulations to you for doing it, and I hope people will check this out and think about it a bit.
Yeah, thanks, man. I think, part of the reason why I even thought to embark on the undertaking in the first place was because of those great examples that you mentioned of other people in this sort of community saying, hey, this thing should really be more accessible and be sort of medium independent. And so, it was really those examples that made me think, hey, well, this is something that's doable. And by comparison, Worm is one of the longest things ever written in the English language. Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality is very, very substantial. It's, many woven pieces together. The sequences as well are an extremely large tome. And so if people are willing to undertake, turning those into an audiobook, then really Replacing Guilt, which is composed of around 40 essays, is much more manageable for any standards. So yeah, I thought it was a great opportunity. And so, yeah, I've definitely benefited from what other people have put out into the world as, their own voluntary labor to go and turn something into audiobook form. And so, yeah, I think like Methods of Rationality, for example, the second time I read that, I actually mostly listened to the audiobook version. And so the community of people who've put things like that together is substantial, and definitely were inspiration for this undertaking. So yeah, thanks to those people for showing what can be done, and for all the positive value that's come out of that. And this is my attempt to kind of pay it forward, right?
Yeah, I realized that just in listing all of those, I neglected to mention the one that I listen to most frequently, which is the audio version of the Slate Star Codex blog.
Yeah, that's
completely worth listening to. So I would be remiss not to mention it. Anyway, all right. So back to the initial question. So why add this to your life? Why do it? And maybe we can even give a sort of, not prescription, but a suggestion of a nice way to consume it. Because the essays, well, let's tell people what it is, right? It's how many essays again?
It's around 40. I haven't done an explicit count actually, so but it's around there.
It's about a month's worth of reading if you do one a day.
Exactly.
And there's good reason to do one a day, because they form a sort of meditation on good and bad reasons for doing anything in life. And I think what's so particular or so unique about the writing style and the content is the very concrete steps which explore like each part of the decision tree, if I can say that. You never feel like, or you feel like you're being presented with options and then walk down, at least to the first order, the consequences of each, and given reasons to think about each option. And if you do this for however many days, roughly 30, you could spend relatively little time, right? It could be an essay with 5 minutes of reading or listening. And I think most people will come away with a renewed sense of purpose and a healthier relationship with the parts of themselves that get them to act at all.
Definitely. And I think it does have quite a wide appeal, but for certain groups of people, it really will ring extra loud. So I think if you've ever been involved in effective altruism, you're very much the target audience for this piece of work. And if you're not inside that group, or you haven't been exposed to that group before, it will still be of high value to you. But for the people inside those kinds of groups, it's something that's really, really going to be hard to ignore and forget and not apply to your life. So a bit of context there. So Nate Soares, who wrote all these posts, and they're just on his website, mindingourway.com, where he's written some other stuff over the years as well. He, for the last few years, is the director of the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, MIRI, where Eliezer Yudkowsky works and does research, along with a few other people that might be familiar to some of our listeners. But so his whole approach from this is seeing these people thinking about existential risk, thinking about effective altruism, thinking about the future of humanity, and how they seem to constantly be motivating themselves with guilt, and how he thinks it's a really inefficient way to be motivating oneself and ineffective as well. And so the work sort of analyzes that, looks at why that is, and then looks at how you can reframe things that begin as guilt-based motivation into being motivated by other drives, other passions, other forms of inspiration, and how that can be much more productive and effective too.
Yeah. Well, what I like is there's a deep appreciation in the essays and a thorough analysis of what drives are available to us, and almost useful ways of stepping into them, of first of all realizing they exist, and then quite methodically finding their motivating force. Because again, it becomes so easy. It feels a bit like mental jiu-jitsu in a way, some of the moves that Soares makes, because he takes a problem which feels completely binding, right? I mean, I'm thinking of, in the first few essays, the problem of, wanting to get a really good grade for a class that you really do not care for. And so the traditional thing is, well, you work really hard, but you cram for the test, but you really hate it, or, you slack off and you feel terrible. And that's the kind of guilt-based reasoning. And the jiu-jitsu move that he makes is sidestepping that entire axis of thinking, and instead of viewing it in the role, or viewing it from the position of trying to minimize the total effort expenditure to reach a certain goal, right? And over again in the series, Soares makes this kind of frame shift of a problem in ways that I think many people will find fairly enlightening. And so what I wanted to actually say there is, as much as I think people who have read or heard or thought about any of the effective altruism sort of philosophy will find it particularly interesting and useful, and especially those people are prone to the kind of guilt-based reasoning that Soares tries to annihilate. Is that too strong a word? I don't know.
Maybe reframe. But yeah, I think part of the book is realizing that as you do that, it's one of those things like, I guess, paying attention to something that arises in consciousness, as soon as you do it, the thing seems to cease to exist,
Yeah, and so as much as it does appeal to those kind of people, my experience of trying to share the essays with people, I've shared it almost exclusively with people who are not particularly familiar with those ideas. I mean, a few obviously were, and they seem to have derived as much use from it as anyone else. So if you're listening to this,
that's really great to hear.
Yeah, I think it appeals to the appeal is broad, and it's deceptively, well, not, there's no element of deception, but I think when people describe why you should listen, I think there's over much focus on this strong tie-in to the guilt-based reasoning of people who are prone to thinking about effective altruism. And turns out just most people in most areas of their lives resonate with this fact that there are the set of things that they want to do that they are not doing.
Yeah.
And they are then experiencing hugely negative effects from the way that they then contort themselves to make those ends come about or fail to do so.
So yeah, I mean, there's some great examples that come up in the first few episodes. Those are already live. You can listen to those now. But like you mentioned, getting a grade for a course that you don't really care about, and there are other examples as well of people are binging Netflix even though they know they should be doing something better with their time, right?
Yes.
Or they end up going 30 minutes past their planned time that they would stop playing Civilization 5 on their computer and instead go to sleep. And they're like, oh, guess I've overshot. Oh, well. And then they keep on playing until 4 a.m. And it's those kind of scenarios. Like if you're the kind of person, which is, I think, a lot of people, if not everybody, who repeatedly finds yourself in those kind of scenarios where you're doing things that are pleasurable or easy, but feel like you should be doing something better with your time, and then you get guilty about it and you get upset with yourself about it, then this will definitely be something that could be of high value to you. And like Replacing Guilt it packs a lot of value into a very concise package. And as we alluded to before, digging into it maybe 1, max 2 posts per day and really giving it space to breathe is a really good way to consume it, right? Like you start thinking about things. Like for instance, I started reading it at the start of a new academic period in my master's, and reading Half-Assing It with Everything You've Got, which is a great title and is a perfect idea to just take away with you. Which talks about that idea of you've got sort of this quality line that's been imposed, which is the grade scale of whatever system you use, right, at your school or university or whatever. But that grade scale is not your preference curve, right? That quality line is not your preference curve. And the whole post is really about that, is this idea of you get kind of try-hard people who have this natural tendency to see a quality line and want to just maximize it. So, if there are grades, you must be able to get the highest possible grade. And there are maybe slacker type people who are like, nah, screw that. What's the point? Like, I'm just going to do the bare minimum that I need to do to just like pass the course. But there's this in-between view that Soares brings, which is like you can satisfy both sides of yourself that resonate with those two kind of groups of people, right? Like you could have this preference curve that says, I want to get a B grade using as little effort as possible, right? And that's where the title of Half-Assing It with Everything You've Got comes from. Like you can view it as an optimization problem, because killing yourself to get the highest grade in that class is not like the sole purpose of your life. And everything is kind of just instrumental on the progress to our terminal goals. And like just that one post totally reframed how I approached anything that has a quality line to it. Anytime there is a grade assigned to something, anytime there's a rating, right? Like if that's not servicing your preferences and your preference curve, like just ignore it. Just achieve your preference curve with the minimum wasted effort. And like that is a fun optimization problem that the rebellious slacker side and the highly motivated try hard side of anyone can get behind, right? And like that was one of the first posts, and it just builds from there, and it's so great. And he's able to use this almost pipeline of mental instruments to reframe the different kinds of guilt into more specific types over the course of the posts. And if you're working through this one day at a time, giving it enough space, giving it enough time to see how these things apply in life and to notice the patterns in yourself, then you really are able to sort of master how to use that pipeline and reframe guilt in all these ways and almost funnel it down into a lesser and lesser and lesser thing until it's at the point where it's not even guilt anymore. It's something else entirely. And that's the beauty of the sequence. And that's also why I think giving it space to breathe like that. Like you could absolutely read it in one sitting, but you definitely shouldn't.
Well, there we go. So with that, we will append a recording from the new podcast to this. And we hope you'll check it out. Check out the link in the description to the podcast and subscribe to it. And with that, I leave you with Gianluca reading an excerpt from Replacing Guilt.
Welcome to the official Replacing Guilt podcast. Replacing guilt. In my experience, many people are motivated primarily by either guilt, shame, or some combination of the two. Some are people who binge watch television, feel deeply guilty about it, and convert that guilt into a burning need to actually do something on the following day. Others are people who feel guilty whenever they stop working before they literally fall over from exhaustion, and in attempts to avoid that guilty feeling, they consistently work themselves weary. I find that using guilt as a motivation source is both unhealthy and inefficient, but yet I find it to be a common practice, especially among effective altruists. Thus, in the coming series of posts, I'm going to explore a whole slew of tools for removing guilt-based motivation and replacing it with something that is both healthier and stronger. My goal is to help people remove guilt-based motivation entirely and replace it with intrinsic motivation. I'm aiming to both reduce the frequency of Netflix binges and reduce the bad feelings that follow. I'm aiming to help people feel like they're still worthwhile human beings if they stop working before they literally drop. I'd like to help people avoid the failure mode where they feel guilty about something for days, even after learning their lesson. And I'm also hoping to remove some shame-based motivation while I'm in the area. My first goal will be to address the guilt that comes from a feeling of listlessness. The vague feeling of guilt that one might get when they play video games all day or when they turn desperately towards drugs or parties in attempts to silence the part of themselves that whispers that there must be something else to life. This sort of guilt cannot be removed by force of will in most people. The trick to removing this sort of guilt, I think, is to start exploring that feeling that there must be something else to life, that there must be something more to do, and either find something worth working towards or find that there really isn't actually anything missing. This first sort of listless guilt, I think, comes from someone who wants to find something else to do, and hasn't yet. Unfortunately, addressing this sort of guilt isn't as easy as just finding a hobby. In my experience, this listless guilt tends to be found in people who have fallen into the nihilistic trap. People who either believe they can't matter, or who believe that no one can matter. It tends to be found in people who believe that humans only ever do what they want, that nothing is truly better than anything else, that there is no such thing as altruism, that morality is a pleasant lie. That class of beliefs is the class that I will address first, starting with the allegory of the stamp collector. In the interim, I invite you to devise your own tools for removing the listless guilt. The tools that people develop themselves are often more useful to them than the tools they are given. Thank you for listening to this narration from the Replacing Guilt series. The original post was written by Nate Soares and can be found at mindingourway.com/guilt.